I moved because the math stopped lying. After 2 years in a lease that devoured time and mood, late fees, a furnace that sounded like it was clearing its throat, and a landlord who always had a quick question right at midnight, I was 90 days from giving up and 30 days from being broke. My budget was a ledger I argued with nightly: rent, groceries, transit, stupid coffee purchases I swore I'd stop. The numbers were patient, merciless. When Mia texted the apartment ad, cheaper 2-bed by the park, landlord is chill, rent split sounds good? I did the thing I always told myself I couldn't. I let someone else's charisma collapse my equations. Mia and I had been co-workers for a year. Office proximity makes people into acquaintances you fold into your life because you already know their lunchtime order. She was all sunny sarcasm and gestures that made small talk feel like choreography. At our desks she was the person who laughed at the boss's jokes and remembered everyone's birthday. It felt safe to say yes. It felt like trusting someone whose face I'd already met in fluorescent light. Moving day felt less like a leap and more like a relief. I rented a hand truck, bought cheap moving blankets, and spent 2 hours taping up boxes like I was sealing evidence for a future civil claim. Mia showed up wearing a playlist and an extra set of keys she handed over like a party favor. She'd baked something, brownies, I think, and had already labeled a bag for Alex, first week survival kit, with coffee and ibuprofen and a half-empty bottle of something herbal. She sextet smiled, the kind of practiced warmth that made you want to forgive the parking ticket the city gave you that morning. We split the deposit. The landlord handed over 2 sets of keys with a pen ache that suggested this was not their first roommate arrangement. Signatures, initials, a scrawl about subletting policy. I told myself I was engineering stability. Cheaper rent was a strategy, convenience was a tool. I had things I didn't tell anyone. Not because they were glamorous secrets, but because caution is a muscle you exercise privately. Under my bed, taped in the shoebox I always used because it was too ugly to be appropriated as decor, was a small envelope of cash, my half-sarcastic, half-serious down payment fund. It was a ritual: fold, slide, seal with scotch tape so it felt permanent. I loved that box because its uselessness made it invisible. I did not mention it when Mia asked where I'd stashed extra blankets. I did not write it in the ledger. For the first time in a long time I kept one thing off the spreadsheet. There was a vocabulary to letting someone into your life that I had underestimated: spare key, emergency contact, can you water my plant if I'm away? At first these were trivial. It seems obvious now, but giving somebody a spare key felt like handing them a soft corner of your day. I gave Mia a key because she asked on moving day when she saw my arms full of boxes and because I trusted her smile. I texted her the Wi-Fi password because she needed to stream something while she set up the living room. I saved her as an emergency contact under MIA, roomy, professionalism mixed with a little neighborly shorthand, and the name sat in my phone like an agreement I didn't explicitly sign. The week that followed was a study in how convenience erodes boundaries. She was inexplicably good at being everywhere I needed her to be. Coffee run? Mia had the cups. A package left at the wrong door? Mia had already rescued it. She had a story for everything: a cousin's surprise visit, a freelance gig that paid cash, a small emergency, she described with a half-grin that suggested being dramatic was her aesthetic. When I left for work she would have already cleared the dish in the sink I hadn't noticed needed washing. When I slid into the couch, exhausted, she'd ask if I wanted the heater bumped up without waiting for an answer. She made being taken care of feel like a perk rather than a favor. I told myself I was being reasonable. I had been exhausted, and practical kindness had an economic value. I recorded the rent deposit in the ledger and set up the automatic transfer. I logged every small expense, every round of takeout. But the ledger is imperfect in moments of fatigue. I stopped documenting the favors: Mia borrowed my kettle, or she picked up my shirts from the cleaner, because they didn't feel like ledger items. They felt like the soft seams of a friendship you didn't want to tear. There were small things that leaned toward a pattern but were easy to dismiss. A t-shirt I hadn't seen since moving in turned up in Mia's laundry basket and she shrugged like it was a joke. She made flippant, performative remarks about my secret jar, teasing like she'd seen my practice of saving receipts in a shoebox, and I laughed because the alternative was to tell her to stop joking about my only private thing. I gave her the benefit of the doubt like a reflex. I gave it as payment for ease. By the end of that first week I realized I had already given more than half of my daily practicalities to the convenience of someone else. Keys, passwords, the kind of domestic favors that slide into habit, I had handed them over without noticing their weight. The rent was clearly divided and neat, everything else felt disturbingly communal. I told myself I was making a trade, less money spent on utilities meant more money toward my real goal. But being tidy with money had never felt so dislocated. The ledger didn't account for trust, and trust, I was discovering, didn't always balance. I would later replay that week, the boxes, the brownies, the spare key, like a matchlit timeline. Right then, though, it simply felt like a quiet, sensible gamble. I slept that night surrounded by moving boxes and a neighbor's cooking smells and a playlist Mia had left running low. I felt both relieved and foolish in that way you do when you're a little too happy to have made the right decision. A week later, something I had never told anyone had vanished. When I signed the lease, I told myself I was making a practical choice, not a sentimental one. Mia was a known quantity at work, fun at the holiday party, always the first to bring snacks, the kind of person people assumed you could text at midnight and she'd answer with a laughing gif. It felt like choosing a familiar face over an unknown door. In theory it was sensible. In practice, familiarity turned into shorthand for trust, and I am ashamed now at how eagerly I equated a clever grin with reliability. The red flags arrived like lint at the bottom of a pocket, small, easy to ignore unless you laid them side by side. They weren't dramatic or cinematic. There were no missing portraits or overnight disappearances. There were instead the microthefts of the everyday, things a roommate could plausibly explain away. At the time I catalogued them more out of habit than suspicion. I keep lists. When I'm anxious I make ledgers. January 7th, mug with chipped rim borrowed, 4 guests, returned washed but missing chip. January 12th, batteries from TV remote gone, replaced with different brand. Writing them down made them quieter, like labeling a bruise reduced its sting. Mia had excuses for most of it. She had a way of starting a sentence with a laugh so the contradiction that followed sounded like a private joke. The first time my favorite sweater came back with the cuffs shrunken and a faint scent of someone else's cologne, she shrugged. Oh my God, I swear I didn't. Maybe it borrowed the dryer. You know how those machines eat things. Her hands fluttered like a dismissive magician's. The sweater looked at me with that distant, betrayed expression only fabric can hold. I smiled and accepted her shrug because it was easier than starting a fight about a thing that cost $100 and had been kept in a drawer since college. Bills came up like fog. Once, in the middle of tacos, she mentioned, half joking, that her phone company had done something terrible, and she'd had to float a couple hundred until payday. Later she would toss off similar lines about a roommate whose friends screwed them or an aunt who needed cash for a plane ticket, but she'll pay me back. Each anecdote arrived incomplete, a semicircle where you expected a full story. I'm not naive, people have financial crises, but Mia's stories never had names, they never had follow-up. They were rehearsed fragments that smelled faintly of scripts. I found I would pause mid-bite and measure the timeline against my own bank ledger like a skeptical tax auditor. She borrowed my things with a casual entitlement that pressed at edges I didn't realize were raw. A pair of pliers I used twice a year went missing for 3 days and returned with the toothpaste she'd been using as a makeshift sealant caked in the jaws. A USB cable went to charge someone's game console and came back wrapped, as if embarrassed, in a twist tie that wasn't mine. Once she said, over wine, that she'd found herself rifling through my desk looking for a pen and laughed so hard her head knocked my shoulder. I laughed with her because the laugh felt like armor. She made it hard to be suspicious. Suspicion felt ungrateful, petulant. A coworker turned roommate. Don't be that person, I reminded myself. Give the benefit of the doubt. Keep the ledger, not the confrontation. The joke about the jar was the worst. We were rinsing wine glasses after a cheap movie and she leaned against the counter and said, deadpan, if you ever need to be robbed, Alex, I will say, oh, sure, your secret jar, and act innocent. She nudged me with her hip, smiling. I returned the nudge with a laugh that sounded thin in my own ears. It was such a specific, reckless joke that my stomach flipped, not because it was mean but because it named something. I kept my shoebox under the bed. It was ridiculous, a theatrical hideout for someone who had spent years clipping coupons and turning down brunch. I had not told her that. I told myself later that my laugh should have been sharper, that I should have said quietly but firmly, don't joke about that. Instead I said, very funny, and we moved on to comparing playlists. There were other moments that felt like corroboration if you were trying to see a pattern. Dishes put away in places I never used, my cheap headphones tangled in a shoebox that wasn't mine, an odd receipt tucked into the mail slot that had a time stamp for when I'd been at work. The receipts rattled at my peripheral vision like insects. I rationalized most of it in 100 creative ways. She's messy. She's hosting friends. She forgets things. A few cents here or there isn't a scandal. I am a detail person. The mind has a dangerous tendency to prefer a tidy explanation. I made rules for myself. Rule 1, don't be paranoid without proof. Rule 2, trust, but verify. Rule 3, keep a record. Keeping a record is what felt like sanity. I photosnap every oddity into a folder labeled Mia. A question mark for generosity. I recorded small conversations. I wrote dates next to the receipts. Not because I wanted to trap her, at least, that's what I told myself, but because the habit of itemizing calmed me. It made the world legible in ink and pixels. The envelope was the thing I had put on my desk that morning because the shoebox underneath the bed was still taped shut from a move, because the rent deadline was a week away and I needed to see the number, and because sometimes seeing a sum in your line of sight helps the panic become manageable. It was a small, folded envelope I had written with a Sharpie, down payment. I remember the loop in the D, the way the ink bled slightly into the cheap paper. I had stacked a book on top of it, a trivial defense. Mia had been in the kitchen refilling ice and humming a song with a melody I couldn't place. When I opened my desk, the envelope wasn't there. The book had been moved an inch to the left, like a body that had shifted in the sleep. The drawer smelled faintly of almond hand soap, not mine, and my breath hitched in a way that made me aware of how loud my chest sounded. I told myself again, don't be paranoid until you have a reason. But the ledger on my phone had 36 small things logged already, and the thing missing from my desk felt like a window being taken out of the house. I had folded the bills twice before tucking them into the plain manila envelope. You get meticulous about small things when everything else in your life has been leaky. The envelope was labeled in a careful block of ink, down payment, and taped to the inside of the shoebox lid with 2 strips of tape, the way I always did so it wouldn't shift. The shoebox itself was unremarkable, scuffed, one corner glued, the faded pattern of cheap roses I'd kept because the box fit under my bed and my footfall never landed there. The pattern was the only secret I had, 3 roses in a row glued to the left side so the lid sat just so. I had never told anyone why that mattered. It was a small superstition and a practical lock in the same breath. That Thursday I was in a hurry. I had dinner plans and a final walkthrough at my old place, a checklist of things to close out. I remember the exact moment because when you keep cash the way I did, the exact becomes a kind of safety. I slid my hand under the bed, felt the familiar corrugated edge of the shoebox, pulled it out, rested it on my knees, and peeled the tape back. Air left my lungs in a way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with betrayal. The envelope was gone. For a second I simply sat there with the lid open like a gullible person waiting for a punchline. The shoebox smelled of dust and old leather. The strips of tape across the lid were sticky and peeled where I had peeled them before. There was an impression left on the inside of the lid where the envelope had lain, the thin rectangle of flattened paper, the ghost of a crease. My fingers traced it and then forgot how to be steady. I told myself the list, the way you recite your bank account numbers to make yourself feel coherent. Maybe I'd misplaced it. Maybe in moving apartments I had put it somewhere safe and then forgot. Maybe I had lent it and absolutely, enragingly, forgot that I had lent it. Maybe I'd been sloppy. The voice in my head was reasonable on purpose, the one that kept me from burning bridges because most of the time bridges are how you get home. Then the hands shook. The shaking was practical. Who had been in my room that week? I ran the week like a ledger. Monday, Mia dropped by to borrow a charger and stayed long enough to reheat her coffee in my mug. Tuesday, I left the door unlocked while I ran to the corner store for stamps and returned to find her sitting on my bed scrolling through my shelf of guilty pleasure novels. Wednesday night she stayed late after drinks and crashed on the couch, borrowing my spare blanket. Thursday morning I'd left for the walkthrough and come back with keys in my hand and an empty show. A box on my lap. The list of possibilities narrowed with each person I remembered. I am a cautious person by nature and cheap by necessity. I did not carry my life in a bank app and think I was clever for it. The envelope was not cash for groceries. It was a down payment. It could not be miscounted into a different shoebox. It could not be accidentally taken to be returned later. And yet I clung to the explanations that sounded less like violation. People borrow, people err, people forget. What I noticed, because being detail-oriented is less about righteousness and more about survival, were the small wrongs that earlier read as quirks. A pair of socks that came back damp and folded differently. A hair tie slung across my bookshelf when I kept mine in a bowl. A joke Mia made in passing about my secret jar that landed like a pebble in the pond and should have made more ripples than it did. Those things had been easy to forgive when I was desperate for friendly faces and cheaper rent. Friendly faces are convenient armor, they also teach you to overlook the discomfort of a stranger making themselves a part of your home. I checked the tape on the lid again. One strip was newer than the other, the adhesive shining faintly under the lamp. There were fingerprints on the bottom of the box, small, quick, like the kind left by someone who had opened it and closed it a dozen times. I do not own that many fingerprints. I own numbers and a ledger and a habit of checking twice. I also owned a roommate who wore charm as a coat and laughed off questions with a practiced, deflective shrug. Practiced lying leaves patterns too. When the rational list had exhausted itself, the room became full of names. The landlord had a key for emergencies, possible, but why would he care about my envelope? Friends had visited, but no one else knew about the shoebox pattern or that I kept money taped to the lid. That detail mattered because it was the one little sanctum I hadn't told anyone, the one small clasp on a larger, messy life. Mia's name floated up first. It was a dull, inevitable thing, not dramatic like in the movies, but cold and matter-of-fact. She moved through the apartment like a social hurricane, rearranging things with a smile and a story to cover every motion. If someone had believed they had a claim to a friend's emergency, or to the convenience of cash available in a neighbor's room, Mia was the person who could make a claim sound urgent and harmless at the same time. I closed the shoebox and set it back under the bed. The flowers on the lid lined up the way they always did. The pattern still fit, the secret was intact except for the slot where the envelope had been. I sat on the floor for a long time with my back against the bed frame and the shoebox between my knees like a poor substitute for answers. There was a small, sharp thing that came with the absence, the idea that trust, once given, could be miscounted as permission. I felt silly for proximity, for assuming charm equaled reliability. I also felt furious in the slow way a freezer door melts into its contents, quiet, inevitable. I could go through my list of possible explanations until I convinced myself I had misremembered every step, or I could begin to document each, because facts are the only kind of language a practiced liar can't parry. I went to my desk, opened a new page in my notebook, and wrote the date. Then I wrote shoebox in the corner like a ledger header. The numbers would follow. The people with keys would follow too. The first name I wrote was precise, like a tally mark, Mia Torres. I told myself I wasn't going to turn into a cartoon spy crouched behind houseplants, but that was the exact mental image I kept fighting off as I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, a damp black pen, and the kind of list-making that used to keep my bills from eating me alive. The list wasn't dramatic, just columns, time, shoes by the door, who came through the kitchen, anything out of place. I wouldn't call it surveillance, it sounded mental and ridiculous, so I called it baseline observation, and wrote it down like an expense I could justify. The first thing I watched was the door. Shoes are banal but telling, a pair of scuffed black sneakers always by Mia's side the first week we moved in, a dusty pair of flats I thought were hers that turned out to belong to a neighbor who used our lobby, a pair of flip-flops that showed up when she had overnight guests. I learned to read them like receipts. Shoes told me time of return, whether someone had lingered while pretending to tie laces, if a new pair appeared and then disappeared, small oddities adding to the ledger of my unease. The second thing I watched was patterns of attention. Who knew what about the box under my bed? I had a shoebox taped with a pattern I had invented because I trusted nothing else. 2 strips of blue painter's tape laid in a diagonal over the lid, a sloppy loop on the corner that made it look like a child's craft project. I had taped the envelope to the underside of the lid and then stuck the lid back on, because that was what frugality and paranoia looked like for me, neat, deliberate, boring. I hadn't told anyone the tape was my signal for, do not touch, not even Priya, because odd rules are easier to keep when you're the only one who knows them. Which is why I started watching who noticed the tape. I timed when people paused near my door, when they'd step into the hallway and suddenly remember they needed to check the mail or grab a charger. Mia would, sometimes, stand outside my room in a way that pretended casual concern, an offhand, "You awake?" But the foot that tapped first against the floorboard felt like a metronome. Once, she laughed, made a joke about my secret jar, and I felt that laugh like a probe. I kept a quiet record. The ledger entries were dull and precise. Wednesday 18:47, keys set on counter, Mia home. Thursday 00:12, distant clacking of heels in corridor, no shoes on mat afterward but damp footprints on welcome rug. Saturday 14:35, Mia lingered at my door for 12 seconds, said, "I'll come back," and left. The format calmed me. Lists make things finite. Things you can list you can prove to yourself, even if no one else would care. After a few days of watching the door and the shoes and the pauses, The memos in my head started to feel less like paranoia and more like a map. There was a rhythm to Mia's absences, late nights, small windows of, I need to run out, phone face down when she sat on the couch, that practiced joke sigh when you asked a pointed question. Once she realized I was paying attention, she changed her pacing, fingers quicker on the keys, quieter steps. The change itself was evidence, because going through your day pretending not to notice someone feels wrong in the way that tells you the truth. You were once the kind of person who gave people the benefit of the doubt until they made you stop. I had made a list of betrayals I would not tolerate, but I hadn't expected I'd ever need to keep timed notes on my roommates' comings and goings. It embarrassed me. I kept the ledger folded neatly under the coffee table like a pledge I might have to present to a sleepy jury. The night I decided to actually stay up was the night the ridiculousness crossed some internal line. I brewed a cup of my most boring tea, lit one small lamp so the apartment wasn't accusatory in the dark, and sat in the hallway with the pad on my knee. I told myself I'd stay for an hour, maybe two. I tracked everything. 23, 28, Mia in living room, TV on low. 0004, footsteps, building door. 0014, distant slamming of the dumpster lid outside. 0021, the bedroom door closed softly. I heard nothing else. I felt silly, heroic, pathetic, all the things at once. I felt more awake than I had in months. There is a particular clarity to anxiety when it is converted into a log. It becomes wiring you can trace. In the morning I did the dull household rounds, dishes, mail, the low-traffic rituals that make an apartment home. Mia was conspicuously chirpy, but that was what she did, brightness as camouflage. I wasn't ready for a full confrontation. I wasn't ready for the fury I had stockpiled. Instead I opened the trash in the kitchen to toss the evening's tea bag and my fingers closed on a folded, crumpled receipt. It should have been nothing, thermal paper people leave like confetti, the name of a coffee shop, a time, a total. But the time was 0021, printed there in the cheap font that tells you where the world forgets details. And the date at the top matched the day I had discovered the envelope was missing. It was an awkward arithmetic of calendar and guilt. The envelope had been there Tuesday morning and gone by Tuesday afternoon. This receipt, for a late-night Americano and a bagel, was stamped 0021 on Tuesday. In my ledger, the entry at 0021 was, bedroom door closed softly, which translated now into an itinerary with a shape that made my stomach drop. There was a smudge of ink on the back, a greasy fingerprint, and a tiny torn corner that fit perfectly into the diagonal tape on my shoebox in my memory. Paper is fragile, but paper keeps time better than memory sometimes. I folded the receipt into my wallet like a matchbox I wasn't ready to strike. Holding that scrap felt like holding a ticket to an interrogation I hadn't planned credentials for. It didn't prove the cash had been taken, yet, but it proved someone had been out at just the hour my house made the most noise. It proved Mia had been up and moving while the rest of the building slept. It was the first thing that moved my suspicion into an actual thing I could point at. I put the receipt in my pocket, closed my ledger, and for the first time since the envelope went missing, I stopped telling myself I was overreacting. The list had a new line, find ATM receipt or camera footage. The room seemed suddenly too small for all the questions I had. I knew I couldn't wait much longer. I tried to keep it light, like asking a roommate whether they'd rinsed the pasta pot. We were in the kitchen, lights too bright for the hour, Mia leaning against the counter with that easy half-grin she uses at work when someone asks for overtime favor. I phrased it like that, casual, nothing that would force a defensive posture. Hey, have you seen an envelope? It was taped into the shoebox under my bed. Said like I might have misplaced a sock. I told the story the same way I'd tell my landlord about a leaky tap, plain facts, no lyricism. Her eyes slid to the floor for a heartbeat, which should have been something, but she pulled the grin up fast and said, no way. You know I'd never touch your stuff, Alex. She said my name like she'd practiced the cadence. She shuffled her feet, one heel tapping the tiles, and the grin stayed too steady. It was the kind of smile that suggests you've already decided which version of events you want everyone to walk away with. I watched her. I had been a coworker for 2 years. I watched people like a ledger. Mia's charmer persona was a reliable addendum on my mental balance sheet, charisma credited, accountability pending. Night the numbers didn't add up. Her denials were crisp and clean, devoid of the tiny human cracks of real surprise, the microfacial things you only catch when you expect honesty, a throat clearing, a brow that hesitates, a breath held too long. She had none. Instead, she offered up the practiced shrug of someone who'd rehearsed being accidentally offended on command. "Maybe I misremembered," she said, tucking a stray curl behind one ear like she was straightening a picture frame. "You keep weird things under your bed. Maybe it fell out," or, she made a little joke about my mystery shoebox and laughed in a way that landed like a paper coin, light and thin. Her voice tried to smooth it over, but the surface tension in the room increased instead of giving. I felt angry in a way that surprised me. It wasn't the money at that moment. It hadn't yet graduated to the full-sized, account-numbered rage that would come later. It was the principle, the slow, cold realization that someone you let into a small, secret part of your life might have used that access and then practiced the exact smile they would use to cover it. "Did you?" I started, then clamped my mouth shut. I had rehearsed ways to ask, hypothetical phrasing, layers of non-accusation. The outline of the envelope was still fresh in my head, the way the tape had stuck to the shoebox lid, the corner of the bill that had, impossibly, been folded twice. I told myself I was being reasonable. Accuse without proof and it would be my word against hers. She knew our workplace enough to make that stick. So I kept it small. "If you saw anything, tell me, okay? I really need that." Mia's smile shifted. For a fraction of a second, she let the practiced sheen falter into a flash of what might have been empathy. "Alex, I promise. I wouldn't mess with your stuff. You can check my room." "You can." She held up her hands like she was offering the keys to a car she had no intention of giving back. "God, if you lost it, that's awful." "Did you check the couch? You hide weird things everywhere." That line, "check the couch," was a classic deflection, a quick lateral move that pretended to help while moving the conversation off her. I could feel my jaw unclench and then clench again. The anger settled into a slow, heavy annoyance at being maneuvered. Her denial wasn't the rip of an honest mistake. It was choreography, the feet shuffle, the explanatory joke, the offered proof of innocence that made me check if I'd accused the wrong person. "You'd let me check?" I asked, because I needed to know how she would handle the question. Would she be flattered I trusted her, or irritated at the implication? "Of course," she said, but there was a pause so small it could have been a hiccup, yet mine heard it as gullies forming in a riverbank. "Seriously. You know I would not touch your stuff." "Maybe," she laughed again, too loud, "maybe it's a sign you need to organize." I wanted to point out the obvious. I had kept that envelope secret for a reason, taped under a shoebox I covered with a pattern nobody would bother to look at. I had not told a single soul. Not my parents, not Priya, not even Marcus. The tape and the shoebox were my tiny fortress. The person I invited into my home had walked through the wall. Instead I smiled a way I hoped would be neutral. Beneath my ribs, the ledger I kept of kindnesses and small favors did a quiet tally. I remembered the times she'd been late explaining cash, the flippant jokes about friends who needed help, the nights I'd come back to find her sitting quietly on the couch like a storm shelter occupant. All of those entries suddenly reframed themselves as patterns. Patterns are what you watch for when you're trying to keep a deposit together. "Okay," I said finally. "If you see anything, tell me." She nodded, and for a breath the world smoothed. Her phone buzzed on the counter and she flipped it over with a casual, practiced movement that left the face-down screen like a small, silent mirror. I wanted to be mad enough to name it, to say, "I know you had access," to break the thin agreement we had about being co-workers turned roommates. But I didn't. Two possible futures sat in front of me, one in which I had been mistaken, apologized, and slept restlessly for a week, the other in which I accused a practiced liar and lost the cubic foot of safety I'd built around my life when the lease became a bad decision. I walked out of the kitchen with the conversation as unremarkable as the sink full of glasses. But something settled behind my sternum, equal parts cold and necessary. Her grin replayed in my head like a recorded answer, its timing too perfect, the inflection too honed. I told myself I was giving her the benefit of the doubt, the version of myself that always kept receipts, that always catalogued departures and arrivals. If she was innocent, the truth would show. If she wasn't, I would find proof. I went to bed that night not with helpless panic but with a small, resolute plan forming. I would not accuse without cause, but I would also not be left to hope. I would watch. I would note. I would start collecting the small things that don't lie. The ledger was already opening in my head. After I brought it up, Mia changed the apartment like someone swapping the lamps to throw the room off balance. It wasn't dramatic at first. It was a dozen small motions that, collected, read like a new language she expected me to misread. She started taking the shower more often. Not once or twice, every morning, sometimes twice a day, the bathroom door closed like a vault. I'd time it, ridiculous as that sounds, 6 minutes, 20 if she was in the middle of whatever she was doing with her phone in the steam. She'd emerge with the same damp earrings and an easy laugh, and I would stand in the doorway counting shampoo bottles like inventory. When I asked about it, she made a joke. I'm testing water pressure for when you get your spa dream, Alex. And it landed too smoothly, like a rehearsed line someone had thrown away and then picked up again. She canceled plans at the last minute. Dinner, a movie, the one night I had scraped together not to be alone in the apartment that smelled faintly of tension, canceled with an apology text that read like a monologue, family thing, sorry, really sorry. Or she'd say she had to work late, she and our landlord shared the same building for some shit twist of fate, and that made the line plausible. Each time she backed out, she looked relieved, the kind of relief you feel when you remove a hot poker from your lap. It made me angrier than I expected. I kept telling myself there could be reasons, loans, guests, a cousin with problems, but my ledger, the little ledger I started keeping because I do everything in ink when trust is fraying, filled up with blanks she left, dates, times, canceled plans, bathroom logs. My handwriting got angrier. Her phone was a new ritual. It went face down on the coffee table like a guilty card in a stupid game. Sometimes she'd check it when I was in the same room, eyes on the screen and then a quick upward smile if I looked away, the kind people practice in mirrors. Once, when I topicalized it, you rarely keep it on the table, she performed a genuine-sounding mock offense. Am I dating my phone now? She'd say, then laugh and flip it back over like a magician hiding his trick. Her jokes used to feel like invitations. Now each barreled through me like deflection. I would watch the shadow of her hand flatten over the black rectangle and think about what could be there, messages deleted, maps of where she'd been, receipts. She perfected versions of the same denials. You know me, the shield she put up, said with a slow blink that implied history was proof enough. Why would I take from you? As if the very question was offensive. There was a heavier one she tossed in a tone like she'd practiced it in the hallway mirror. If I did something like that, don't you think I'd have a reason you'd understand? Reasons. Always reasons. The more she said them, the less they landed as excuses and the more they sounded like stage directions she'd learned. I kept giving her the benefit of the doubt in the smallest ways possible. I checked the shower's wetness and didn't make a scene. I wrote down the canceled plans and didn't call her out in front of the neighbors. I told myself a million little stories to stall the accusation. The landlord might have stopped by, she could have lent money, she'd moved it accidentally, but each story felt flush with wishful thinking. It was a bought postponement. What I couldn't postpone was the arithmetic of my life. Rent was a fixed number that did not forgive mistrust. There was the down payment tucked in that shoebox under the bed, a pattern only I knew, the shoebox turned inward with the tape along a crooked seam. I had not told anyone about the envelope, the certainty that it was gone gnawed at me like a sore tooth that refused to calm. I needed more than feelings. I needed receipts, timestamps, something that would make her words fail in the same way they had failed me. So I did what I do when I can't sleep, I became methodical. I started treating the apartment like a ledger itself. The shower schedule went into a column. Cancelled plans went into another. I left small bait routines, put my keys on the counter and, without saying anything, watched whether her hand brushed past them. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. Once I blocked the line of sight to the bedroom and watched her come out with a towel that smelled faintly of someone else's detergent. I called it observation and not paranoia and repeated that word until it sounded like a spell. She noticed my observation and laughed it off, which was probably exactly what she wanted. When I suggested we both keep our phones face up to avoid weirdness, she folded her arms and said, "Really, Alex? We're roommates, not boxers." Her smile had that practiced, friendly edge it had always had, except now the humor tasted like a wedge driven under my ribs. The longer she lied, or maybe just stayed in a state that looked like lying, the more I understood I had a choice. I could explode and fling accusations with all the righteous force of someone wronged, and possibly be wrong. Or I could sit and gather proof until my words had weight. It was not brave. It felt cowardly at times, because every minute of waiting felt like mercy to someone who might not deserve it. But mercy without evidence was also a way of erasing my own certainty. So I became quieter. I kept my ledger in the drawer instead of on the table. I began sleeping with the shoebox in my head like a second pulse. I started double-checking things I had never thought to check, washing machine times, the building's delivery logs, the dates on the coffee cups we left by the sink. I told no one, because evidence mattered more than outrage. Accusing without it would be losing a different kind of thing, my own sense that I was fair. She went on with her life. More showers, more cancelled plans, the phone face down like some compact lie, and I watched like someone learning to read in a language they'd wanted to be fluent in overnight. Every deflection she offered sounded like a line from a play I'd seen a million times in other people's messy lives. The more she performed, the more convinced I became that I needed proof before I could accuse her again without losing myself. I told myself patience. Until proof. Then, on a Tuesday when the neighbor's dog barked at noon and the radiator clicked in its old, sympathetic way, I found something small on the counter that made my breath hollow out. I started collecting evidence the way you collect shells at the beach, careful, almost ashamed of needing them. I would hover in the apartment with my phone in one hand and a pocket notebook in the other, pretending to adjust a picture frame while I slid a charger into my bag or snapped a photo of a receipt left in plain sight. It felt ridiculous and petty and necessary all at once. Ridiculous because who was I becoming? A person who photographed other people's trash like a private investigator. Petty because the things I catalogued were small, a chipped mug, a scarf, the universal cable for my phone, and necessary because the missing envelope under my bed was not an abstraction anymore. It was a hole with a date attached to it. Finding the folded strip of paper in Mia's magazine was accidental and surgical at the same time. I was looking for an old issue of a food column that I'd meant to try, a plausible, domestic to be in her space, and my fingers brushed the spine of a glossy magazine stacked neatly on her shelf. Something papery slid under my thumb. I pulled it free and saw the small, serrated edge of an ATM receipt, folded in like a secret. The date matched the day I realized the envelope was gone. The bank's logo, a simple geometric flower I'd seen 100 times at the corner ATM, was smeared slightly from where it had been handled. There was a faint coffee stain on one corner, and a fingerprint smudged across the withdrawal amount. I held that folded strip like someone holds a key that doesn't fit any obvious lock, tightly, hoping for confirmation, afraid of what confirmation would let loose. The thing about receipts is everyone has an explanation for them. That was cash for a friend. I was paying a delivery person. I forgot to deposit it. They are tiny, ordinary, infinitely plausible objects unless you can make them an index of pattern rather than accident. That was why I didn't storm into Mia's room with the paper clenched in my fist. That was why I didn't post a screenshot of it and ask for the internet to arbitrate my life. I made a plan because I know how easy it is to be the person who cried theft before they had a case. So I started a ledger. I used one of those narrow reporter's notebooks, cheap, with a red tape binding that I liked because it made the pages look official even when my handwriting ran sideways from nerves. The headings were bland and utilitarian. Date, item, context returned. Witness/notes. I told myself it was for my own clarity, that keeping a record would keep my panic from turning into accusations. The ledger felt, in its own way, like a plea for reason. If I framed the facts, maybe I could also frame the resolution. I wrote the first few entries in a hand that tried to be indifferent. May 11th, cream mug, chip on rim, borrowed, I'll return, no. May 12th, phone charger, work night, returned, cable frayed. May 14th, shoebox envelope missing, discovered morning. Last seen night prior. After the ATM receipt, each entry tightened. I photographed the receipt against a plain white sheet, the timestamp visible in the corner, and emailed the image to myself with a one-word subject line, evidence. I slipped the physical receipt into a small zip-top bag and taped it into the back pocket of the ledger. The strip of paper crinkled faintly under the plastic like a paper worm. The ledger began to read, in aggregate, as something less like neurosis and more like a map. Small things, taken alone, live in the margin of roommates' lives. A mug borrowed, a sweater taken during a sudden storm, a charger plugged into the only outlet at 2 a.m. But the map showed repetition. Always borrowed late night. Always I'll pay you back. Always returned altered or not at all. I catalogued excuses I'd heard. I left my wallet, my card is acting up, I sent the money, it's pending. I noted times when those excuses lined up with her leave-taking, a quick exit from the apartment at 3:10 p.m., a text to pick something up an hour before an ATM confirmation, small, actionable correlations. I felt ridiculous and righteous in equal measure. There were evenings I sat on my bed, the open ledger across my knees, and watched Mia move around the kitchen as if nothing had changed. She would joke about my secret jar, mimic the pattern I'd used to hide the shoebox as though to charm me into forgiving my own carelessness. I wanted so badly to believe it was all a misunderstanding. That was the old me, the one who gave people the benefit of the doubt until doubt became reckless. Keeping the ledger became an exercise in self-preservation. I stopped leaving the bedroom door ajar. I started photographing scenes instead of remembering them. The mug on the sink with toothpaste dregs in it, the scarf flung over the banister that smelled faintly of Mia's perfume, a receipt sticking out from a pile of magazines. My notes were clinical: time, action, item, but between the lines my hands trembled. The ledger recorded not just objects but the striping of my own trust. Each borrowed item was a thread I was counting, not cutting, and every correlation was a tally in a slow divorce from naivete. I also documented what could have been coincidences. I forced myself to write down plausible stories the way defense attorneys do, maybe for friend, cash for cab, work expense. It felt both fair and like alibi making on my own behalf. I wanted to be able to stand in a room with Mia and say, with more than a hiss of suspicion, look, here is a pattern you cannot meaningfully explain away. I wanted receipts that couldn't be turned into stories. Taping the ATM slip into the ledger felt obscene and satisfying at once. It was a small, tangible victory, a thing that could not be erased with charm. But I also knew it was fragile. One receipt in a magazine could be a coincidence. 10 entries of the same language, the same excuses, the same timing, could not be shrugged off as forgetfulness. I closed the notebook that night, my thumb pressed against the plastic bag. The ledger had become cold comfort and proof both. I was still terrified of being wrong, of shattering a workplace friendship into accusations that would echo back on me. But for the first time since I had found the empty shoebox, I felt like I was doing something other than blaming myself. I was counting. I was collecting. I was making a case that, if the time came, I could stand behind. I left the ledger on my bedside table and turned off the lamp. Under the floorboards, something small and metal tumbled in my pocket, a coin I'd been carrying all day for luck, and when it hit the wood it made a sound like a starting pistol. I didn't move. I was waiting for the sound of the next step. I turned the overhead light on and left it on because confrontation feels cleaner in blunt white. I had the receipt spread across the coffee table like evidence. The ATM slip with the stamped time, the crumpled cafe receipt from the same night, a printout of my ledger where I'd been tracking every awkwardly returned sweater, every, oh, keep it, and, I'll Venmo you later. I'd written dates in the margins in my small, exact hand: March 3rd, envelope missing, March 4th, noticed Mia home late, March 5th, found ATM receipt, March 10th, asked casually, March 12th, planned confrontation. I told myself to breathe and then did it anyway. The ledger felt heavier than the shoebox ever had. The shoebox had been under my bed for 3 years, taped shut in a pattern I didn't tell anyone because that's how I kept secrets, carefully, with a rhythm. The envelope inside wasn't an abstraction. It was a down payment, 3 months of overtime written in receipts and ramen dinners. It was everything I kept counting toward. When I found the box, the envelope was gone. The rest of my life condensed into the absence of paper. She came in like she always did, with her laugh that sounded like it came pre-packaged for any awkwardness. For a second, the second before the light hit the table and seats, I almost believed the old shorthand that her smile meant safe. Then the room registered. She saw the paper, the ledger, the way I'd slipped the ATM receipt into the middle of the spread like a bookmark you can't miss. Alex? She was casual at first, the practiced cadence people use when they want to make you think they're relaxed. What's up with the board meeting? Sit down, I said. My voice didn't wobble. I don't know when I stopped being the person who let things get fast and messy. Maybe when I hated being surprised. Maybe when I learned the math of rent. She sat like a performer taking a beat before the punchline. The sequence began, like an actor warming, surprise, immediate, then a flicker of anger, a flash in her eyes, jaw tightening, then the mask of hurt, carefully placed, like she'd had it sewn on. I pointed to the ATM receipt. Why did you withdraw $500 from the ATM 2 blocks from our building at 11:46 p.m. the night the envelope disappeared? She blinked. Pride stayed on her face a hair too long. What? Alex, she tilted her head, the practiced confusion. I don't even know what that is. Why would I? You used the card, I said. It's your bank. The receipt has a branch code that checks out. I found it on your shelf under your mug. Mia's face shifted. The anger landed like a small, sharp stone. My shelf? Why are you rifling through my things? Her voice went up an octave to make indignation theatrical. You know that's not okay. I had rehearsed questions, not speeches. I moved through them the way I'd learned to with spreadsheets, clear, verified, brief. You were home late that night. You said you were at Riley's. Your coworker told me you'd left early. I pulled the cafe receipt out and set it beside the ATM slip. This was time-stamped 20 minutes after that withdrawal. Her hands went to her chest like a script. She inhaled deep enough to fill the room with a false, performative hurt. Alex, you can't just, accusing me like this. I'm your roommate. I'd never take your. When she lied, it sounded exactly like a practiced denial. There was a cadence she'd used once before when someone asked about her credit cards or guests. The same syllables, the same phrasing designed to make the other person doubt his own tally. The voice of betrayal wasn't a squeal or a crack, it spoke in whole, confident sentences. My stomach went cold because she wasn't fumbling. She was delivering. What makes this different from the Flanagan scarf? I asked, flipping the ledger open to a page where I'd written smaller grievances beside the bigger ones. February 14th, scarf not returned, January 20th, borrowed cash for rent. I had the dates not because I'm petty but because patterns are the anatomy of trust. You didn't return stuff before. You borrowed small amounts. It added up. The envelope wasn't small. Her false hurt hardened into something razor edge. You're keeping a ledger? She laughed, harsh and surprised, as if my being meticulous were the comedic moment. Alex, that's. Don't twist it, I said. Just answer. Did you take the envelope? The sequence went on. Prize, anger, hurt. Now a flash of real fear crossed her face, a small fissure where rehearsed emotion couldn't penetrate. That fissure was what I'd been waiting for, the first honest thing. She swallowed and looked down at the table, at the neat cleavage between the receipts like a mouth. Her hands trembled, once, and then steadied. No, she said. Quiet, too smooth. I set a glass of water down, not for her, for me. My pulse was an accounting error I couldn't reconcile. If not, why did you go to an ATM that night? Why did you lie about where you were? Mia's response was fast now, protective. I went to get cash for Kira. She had to move her stuff. I swear. You know I would never. It was the same story she had used before the first time a window in her story had been pointed out. A friend's emergency. A crisis. The rehearsed details, name, need, plausible urgency. Her voice tried to build sympathy around the lie like a blanket around a broken thing. I felt something hard and small and precise snap inside me, a tolerance I couldn't afford anymore. If that's true, why does your bank app show 3 withdrawals that month right after you were around my room? Why does the cafe receipt put you back here 20 minutes after the withdrawal? Why did you tell me you'd been at Riley's when you weren't? Mia blinked, and for a flash the actor left the stage and a real person registered, not contrite, not guilty, just someone in trouble counting options. She started with the practiced pivot, proposing restitution. I can pay you back. We can split things, I can get a job. I'd IOUs, I said. I kept my voice flat because melodrama helps liars. I want to know where my money is. She looked like she'd been cut. Her hurt was now a shield and a currency. I can't believe you'd, after everything you lied about, I said. After the coffee cup, the forgotten charger, the random cash requests. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think I couldn't add? She laughed then, low and sharp, and it wasn't funny. You always think you're so exact, she said. You'd rather keep sums in a box and make lists than live your life. I thought about telling her the shoebox's pattern, how intimate and silly it had felt to fold bills and feel safe. But that pattern had been the only thing I'd kept from people, the only private geometry that meant I'd planned forward. I thought of that envelope, its emptiness like a missing tooth. I kept it because it mattered, I said. Not so you could pick it up when you were stressed. Her eyes cooled. She looked as if she were deciding whether to laugh or cry. She reached toward the table, toward the receipts as if to rearrange them, to make the story prettier. I closed the ledger and stood up. The light hummed. Tell me where it is, I said. Now. The practiced hurt, the charm, the rehearsed emergency, they all seemed suddenly brittle. She opened her mouth and then closed it. For the first time in weeks, I couldn't tell whether she was acting or thinking. Her next move would tell me more than 1,000 receipts ever could. I waited. She had a story ready before I finished the question. We were at the tiny kitchen table, my receipts fanned like evidence, the shoebox lid still warm in my hands from when I'd checked under the bed, and Mia started in the same even tone she used for office gossip, for consoling coworkers, for smoothing over someone else's bad joke until they laughed at it too. It wasn't mine, she said, and I felt that rehearsed pause, the one that meant she'd circled this line before. A friend. She needed cash, eviction, like, right then. I gave it to her. I thought she'd deposited into the wrong envelope by accident and I was going to sort it out. I swear I was going to give it back. She looked at me with an expression designed to sell the guilt as shared. Not that she was guilty, that we both were complicit in the same human mess. Her palms were flat on the table, fingers splayed like a woman who had nothing to hide. Her shoulders carried that practiced slump, vulnerable, exhausted, beyond reproach. I wanted to catalog it the way I'd cataloged receipts, date, time, amount, performance. You gave away my envelope? My voice sounded smaller than I felt. I had the ledger in my pocket, a notebook with exact amounts and dates. I had the ATM slip from the 20th, Mia's username scribbled in the corner, and the coffee receipt that placed her downtown 2 blocks over the morning it went missing. I had the shoebox, the precise way the tape had been folded to match the pattern only I knew. I had all that and she had a story. She promised she'd put it back. I thought, look, Alex, people need help. She tilted her head, offering a smile that had gotten us free club covers and cheaper concert tickets more than once. Besides, you're always so dramatic with your, what do you call it, emergency jars. The word dramatic landed heavier than she meant it to. It was a pivot, an attempt to make my response the problem. You could see the gears turning. If she could get me apologizing for being upset, the theft could be smoothed over as a misunderstanding. I felt the trust I'd given her, tentatively, like a key left in a friend's car because I'd been tired and trusting. Crack. Not fireworks crack, but the quiet, splintering sound of something you didn't notice until it let in a draft. I wasn't dramatic about it, I said. I asked once where my savings were. You said you hadn't seen. I stopped myself from cataloging every time I'd given her the benefit of the doubt. I had cash taped in a shoebox, Mia. It was for a deposit. For a down payment. You know that. Her eyes flicked down to the shoebox lid and away, fast enough to be trained. I know. She bit the end of her sentence like a practiced line. I know how important it is. That's why I helped. I mean, if I hadn't, what if she'd lost her place? You know me, Alex. I'm the kind of person who helps people. It's funny how the same sentence can be both apology and accusation. She was apologizing to herself for doing something she thought a decent person would do, while accusing me of not being decent enough to understand. She tried to make me a villain. Help doesn't mean take someone's money, I said. The ledger in my pocket was suddenly heavier. The ATM slip had the exact date my cash vanished. The amounts matched down to the last 20. Logic lined up like dominoes in my head and she was standing in front of them, smiling with one hand on a story she'd shaped to survive the fall. She reached across and touched my wrist, light, theatrical. You're overreacting, she said softly, like a parent calming a child. You're treating this like some huge betrayal. Fix this. I'll get it back. She promised she'd return it. Why make a scene? She used humor next, a little joke about my secret jar that landed flat, but it was the accusation that stayed with me. Why make a scene? The question wasn't a confusion, it was a weapon. She was asking me to choose peace over paperwork, to let my anger be quieted by her words and her promise. She was asking me to roll over. I could feel the old versions of me leaning toward that role, the person who wanted harmony, the budget-conscious roommate who kept spreadsheets and who had just moved and hoping to buy herself a little breathing room. She was right that we could fix this quietly. But the ledger had taught me to be literal about numbers, and numbers don't do favors. Fix it how? I asked, and I kept my voice small because I wanted to document the answer. She blinked, and for the first time that night there was a microslip, her eyes seeking salvage, not a practiced lane. We'll get it back. I'll talk to her. She's shaken, okay? Maybe she panicked. It's not like you didn't have other options. The last clause was clipped, a soft shove. She was implying I'd been careless, left the money out, made it accessible. She wanted responsibility shared, diluted. Responsibility was a ledger entry. So was theft. The words she chose were deliberate. You have an ATM receipt from the 20th for the same amount, I said, and I slid the receipt across the table. Her practiced face smoothed, then tightened. You were in that area the morning I noticed the envelope gone. The coffee receipt puts you 2 blocks over. That's not a coincidence, Mia. She picked up the slip without looking at it too long, like someone skimming a script for the part not yet assigned. I don't remember the details, she said. I've been dealing with a lot. Then, softer, if something happened to it, I would have told you. You could hear the way the sentence was built to survive, conditional verbs, future promises, and a refusal of past accountability. She offered to make it right, if I wouldn't make a scene. She promised restitution on the back end only if I swallowed the lie on the front. There was a moment of silence where the apartment held both of our breaths. The shoebox lid sat between us like a coin on a table. I thought of every time I'd trusted her smile. I thought about how obvious she'd become, the way every deflection had a rehearsed arc. I'm not asking you to make me whole with apologies, I said, quieter than before. I'm asking for the truth. She laughed, too bright. You always make everything into a huge test, Alex. Her hand left the receipt and hovered, palms up, like a woman offering herself as a martyr. I have a life. I have things I handle. This isn't how I live. You're making this into a thing. That was the flip. Not just denial, but accusation, that I was the one turning theft into drama. She wanted to rob me of justice and then blame me for wanting it back. I could feel my gullibility in the mirror of her words, a part of me immediately wanting to let it slide because confrontation was messy and because we worked together and because I was tired. But the ledger in my hand was patient. It calculated and waited. I sat there with my receipts and my shoebox and felt my certainty harden into a plan that was no longer about leaning toward her word. I asked for her phone. She smiled and said no. I asked for names. She offered none. She promised again. I wrote everything down, not as a confession but as a trail. The doubts that had been sneaking in like mildew now had light poured on them. I left the kitchen with my notebook open and the picture of her hands in my head, open, palms up, expecting sympathy. I didn't call out her lie, I couldn't yet. I needed more than voice and accusation. I needed allies. I walked out into the stairwell and typed 2 words into my phone before I stopped and stared at them, help me. Then I hit send to Priya. I called them because I couldn't do the waiting, couldn't sit with that shoebox gaping under my bed and pretend the missing envelope was a fluke of my own forgetfulness. Priya came first, shoes on the doormat like she'd always been ready to run a meeting, laptop in one hand, planner in the other. Marcus arrived 10 minutes later with his coat still dusted from the street and that look he gets when he thinks he's about to write something unfair. They'd both told me, in their versions of blunt love, that I was too trusting. I wanted them there so I could stop being that person, even if for one night. I spread everything on the kitchen table like evidence, the shoebox lid with the tape pattern I'd used, the coffee receipt I'd found on the hallway floor the morning the envelope vanished, the ATM slip I'd fished out of a book on Mia's shelf a week earlier, and my ledger, handwriting that looked smaller and more ridiculous than it did in my head, listing times I'd lent tools, chargers, cash, and the dates when things didn't come back. It felt vulnerable to put it all out, but more honest than keeping it folded under my shirt. Priya didn't do fingers in the air hypotheses. She read receipts like a line on a map. This coffee, 10:05 a.m. on the 14th, ATM, 10:12 a.m. on the 14th. You said you last saw the envelope the night of the 13th, right? She set them down and opened a spreadsheet with a speed that made me want to kiss her. She labeled columns, time, place, witness, corroboration. Organization soothed me. It felt childish and crucial at the same time. Marcus did what Marcus does, translate suspicion into search. He asked questions that pulled apart stories we'd let sit. Who else had keys? When did Mia change her shift? Did anyone else see her leave the building on the morning of the 14th? When I showed him the ATM slip, he frowned and said, "She doesn't have cash intake like that normally." His voice was reserved, but he kept a tight jaw like a man sharpening a knife. I could see him forming a plan with his eyes. We divided the work. Priya called Mia's list of plausible alibis, co-workers who'd seen her that week, the friend Mia had mentioned in passing when she'd said her cousin's car needed a deposit, the barista who might remember a woman with a fleece bag. Marcus started digging through whatever left-behind paper trail he could find, receipts that had been tossed in the trash under a bag, a parking stub stuffed between couch cushions, screenshots from the mutual group chat on my phone that suddenly seemed like a lifeline. The small wins came in quiet waves. Priya found a message from a coworker who'd texted Mia that morning asking if she could cover a meeting. Mia had answered, "Sorry, tied up, drop by later." The coworker swore she'd never seen Mia in the office that morning. Marcus turned up a partial screenshot. Someone at a Thursday lunch had photographed the receipt Mia paid with and sent it to a friend with the note, "Finally covered it, thanks." The timestamp on the photo and the ATM slip matched too neatly. The more we pinned pieces together, the less room Mia had to breathe. She had been building stories that required air. Our receipts sealed them. Priya, who organizes everything from bake nights to funeral logistics with the same steady hand, made a timeline that looked like something from a detective show. Mia left the apartment at 9:48, ATM withdrawal 10:12, coffee at 10:05, not consistent, text to friend at 10:30 about paying them back that contradicted the story she'd told me later that evening about being at work. Marcus kept asking the simplest question, where did the money go? And it made every lie tilt. There was a moment in the middle of the night when the three of us sat under the kitchen fluorescent surrounded by receipts and our own tired faces, and I let myself feel how good it was to have allies. Priya poured us instant coffee like it was an offering, neat and practical. Marcus, who usually used his hands for walling off people who were too close, put his palm flat on the ledger and said, "We'll make this clean. We'll back you up." It was a balm I hadn't known I needed. It made me apologize silently for every time I'd given Mia the benefit of the doubt. But the comfort hardened my edges too. Where I had been tentative, planning for polite reclamation or an awkward cash return, Priya's tone stayed steady and surgical. Marcus's jaw didn't unclench. The more evidence we had, the less room there was for the kind of soft exit I'd been hoping for. This wasn't going to be a conversation about feelings over tea. It would be a confrontation with receipts, ledger lines, and people willing to say what I wasn't ready to. That trust couldn't be counted on until it was earned, or in my case, re-earned by admission and restitution. There were small, brutal inconsistencies that beat a steady drum. Mia had said she'd moved the envelope herself during a panic and then put it back. No sign of the envelope existed in her story's timeline. She claimed cash emergencies but had Venmo confirmations to friends that contradicted who she'd said had been paid. A coworker forwarded a screenshot of a chat where Mia asked someone to hold the cash until later, a phrase that, on that morning, looked like planning rather than panic. We printed copies. We made 2 stacks of physical proof like 2 small armies. I felt oddly professional arranging them, a person defined by receipts and dates rather than the ache of betrayal. The ledger, my tiny, obsessive record, suddenly seemed less ridiculous. It was a map of patterns others had called me too trusting for ignoring. In bold ink, next to a line item where Mia had borrowed my drill and returned it with the chuck broken, I wrote, pattern. Under the date of the missing envelope, I wrote, proof pending. When we left the apartment to go get Mia, because it was time for her to explain to 3 people instead of me alone, the city felt like it was on a countdown. Marcus tucked the folder under his arm like a shield. Priya texted that she'd started when where how notes in case we needed to turn this into something official. I felt a strange clarity, a narrowing that steadied me. I wasn't the gullible person who'd left cash under a shoebox anymore. I was the person with receipts, witnesses, and a short fuse for denials. We stood on the landing outside her door with evidence in our pockets and something harder in our throats. I wanted to say one last apologetic thing to myself for ever trusting a rehearsed smile. Instead, I knocked. The sound echoed. I could hear Mia moving inside, shifting, breathing, maybe deciding which version of the truth she would try next. We sat at my kitchen table like jurors and witnesses at once. The lamp threw a pool of yellow over the papers, my ledger with tidy columns, the shoebox lid pushed to the side, the envelope's empty corner where my name used to be folded into cash. Priya had a pen poised like a gavel. Marcus had the phone turned face up between his palms, the thread open to show timestamps and an image of an ATM receipt. Mia had nothing to hold, her hands kept finding the back of a chair, the sleeve of her sweater, the little habit of people who are practiced at looking like they're thinking. I'd positioned the evidence more carefully than anything I'd ever bought on a payment plan. There were the numbers, $3,250, written in my own cramped hand, a line item in the ledger titled down payment, do not touch. There was a date on the ATM receipt Marcus held up like it hurt him to do so, the same date the envelope went missing, the same night I'd been late at work and she'd texted that she was heading out with friends. There were the texts Marcus had pulled, an exchange between Mia and someone listed only as J about a cash pickup at TWO in the morning. Little things that, individually, could be shrugged off. Together they were a map. When I first asked her about the envelope, she laughed, too bright, too quick, the exact laugh that had once made me believe her. Now, faced with the paper trail spiderweb, the laugh didn't fit. She opened her mouth and closed it again. I watched the rehearsed grin slip and the muscle in her jaw tighten. You don't have to do this, she said finally, voice low. Her eyes were glossy. Alex, I mean, look, I know it looks bad, but you know me. I've never. Marcus didn't let her finish. He tapped the receipt. So that's not you? Right? 2 a.m., 3,200 cash withdrawal, corner of 6th. Names on your card gets you out of that? Her eyes flicked to him like someone scanning for an exit. I don't know how that would be my receipt, she said. It was the old pivot, deny, make everything someone else's problem, charm the room into disbelief. Maybe I was there with someone. Maybe I was asked to get money for someone. You know how people drag you into stuff. You were the only other tenant in the house that night, I said. Saying it felt mechanical and then incendiary. You told me you were going out with friends. You borrowed my blanket for your couch, you had access to my room. You knew where the shoebox was because you'd helped me move it when I first came in. Mia's shoulders hitched. She laughed again, but this one was thin, brittle. You hid your life in a shoebox, Alex. That's... She flapped her hands like she was trying to find a reason that would be softer. You can't expect me to have thought. Don't, Priya said. She was usually the one who organized Tupperware. When she spoke, the room untangled. Just answer the question. Did you take the money? Mia's voice narrowed. She swallowed, and the practiced cadence she used at work, the ease that smoothed over deadlines and mutual favors, fell into pieces. I took some. The words were nothing like an apology. They were an admission, a ledger finally balancing in a way that made my chest go cold. For a second she seemed to hold herself together by sheer will, hands clasped like a sermon, voice trying to be small and contrite at once. It was for Jay, she said. He needed it. I promised he'd pay me back. I thought I could get it and then return it. I miscalculated. I didn't know how long it would take. I thought I could fix it before you even. There it was, the story that had explained every dodged question before, the emergency, the friend, the urgency. It fit the pattern she'd used in the months we'd known each other. It fit until it didn't, because the texts showed Jay asking Mia to meet at 1:48 a.m., because the bank slip matched Mia's card's last 4 digits, because I kept a habit of photographing the envelope on the day I added cash. I can pay you back, she said. Her sentence tumbled into bargaining so quick it smelled rehearsed. I can, weekly. I can sell my stuff. I can get another job. I don't want this to be police. I don't want the landlord involved. We both work at the same company, Alex. Do you really want that mess? You know how small this city is. I can make it right. Her eyes pleaded, and there was a terrifying sincerity to it. Not the theatrical kind, it was the sincere calculation of someone laying out a contract. You sign, I pay. We pretend we never had to stain the workplace or the building with this. You let me stay, but only if you don't tell. You take what you can get and you don't ask for more. I thought about the down payment, about the months of clenching my teeth, about the monthlies and the spreadsheet cells I'd gone over 100 times in my head while I decided to move in here. I thought about the rule I'd never said aloud, that some things weren't for other people's hands. I felt the box under my bed as if by touch, like a phantom limb missing something vital. Her voice made the bargain sound generous. I'll fix it, don't escalate. But the math in my head translated differently. It was a bandage offered for a compound fracture. It would not make my bone knit nor heal the way she'd rewritten our private rules, that between roommates, between friends, you didn't pawn off someone's future without consent. She wasn't offering restitution, she was offering containment, a way to neutralize the consequences only as long as I kept my lips sealed. I can't just pretend, I said. My voice was steadier than I felt. Saying it aloud rewired something. This isn't just money. It's the way you thought you could change the rules after that's the part one can't accept. Her face changed then, the practiced lies peeling back to something rawer. Please, she whispered. Don't make me, don't bring it to them. If it's the job, if it's the landlord, people will take sides. I'll lose everything. I'll lose my apartment, my job. I'll lose you. I looked at her and saw the person who'd once covered for me when I'd missed a rent check after a bad month, the coworker who'd stayed late and taken on my shifts without complaint. I also saw the person who had, that night, chosen an emergency story over my savings. Both truths sat in the room like fractured glass. Priya folded her arms. Marcus's jaw tightened like a hinge. The receipts between us felt less like paper and more like a verdict waiting to be read. Mia's hand found mine, abrupt and clumsy, seeking what I don't know, mercy, agreement, a continuation of a relationship she could still control. I kept my hand on the table, inches away, and thought about the shoebox, the tiny pattern I'd used to hide it, and the fact that some secrets are only safe while they remain secrets. She promised again, soft this time, almost pleading, no cops, no landlord, just me and her and a payment plan. Make it right. Keep your life. She tried to make it sound like an ethical choice. I could feel the edges of the choice I hadn't expected forming, justice that would burn everything to ash, or a hush that would let a thief walk free if she kept her word. I'm good at ledgers. I could add up her offer in my head, convert weeks to dollars, promises to receipts. I'm less good at weighing what counts as enough when trust is the item at stake. I said, I need to think about it, because thinking buys time, and time was one thing Mia hadn't accounted for. She nodded like I'd granted clemency. For a moment I believed she would accept my silence as currency. Then Marcus slid another screenshot across the table. It wasn't the receipt this time. It was a selfie Mia had sent to Jay an hour after the withdrawal with a caption that read, "Done." THX. Mia's face went slack. The bargain she'd offered crumpled into the room like a thrown-away receipt. She mouthed something, but the words were gone, and I realized the only way out of this would be a reckoning more thorough than a whispered promise. I stood in the living room with 3 cardboard boxes that had been labeled in my neat, apologetic handwriting: kitchen, fragile, books, sentimental, do not drop. The apartment still smelled faintly of Mia's lemon cleaner and whatever perfumes she used when she wanted the day to start easier for everyone. It had been my home for 3 months, and for 3 months it had felt like a rented stage set where I was a prop who paid the bills. The choice I had to make was simple on paper and terrible in person: press charges and drag this into court, move out immediately and eat whatever it cost to escape the proximity, or try to patch my credit and sanity well enough to keep living here until I could muster a proper down payment. The ledger in my notes app tracked every variation. I ran the numbers until my eyes hurt. Legal fees were a beast that liked to hide in long-form invoices. A criminal case might close, but it would take months, time I didn't have before my lease ended and the deadline for my down payment. My job and the landlord formed a thin, unpleasant pressure system. Any scandal was likely to manifest as awkward proximity at best and a lost reference at worst. I chose a path that felt like compromise and also like taking the only practical road left. We, Mia, Marcus, Priya, and I, ended up doing what exhausted people do when they want justice but also want to keep functioning. We negotiated a settlement. Marcus printed everything: ATM timestamps, the coffee receipt, our ledger of borrowed items, and set them on the kitchen table like evidence in a slow-burning trial. Priya kept us on schedule, sliding a list under my hand that read, what she pays now, what she owes, how long before we change the locks. Mia cycled through surprise, then anger, then a version of contrition so polished it still felt dishonest. In the end she handed me $250 in cash, Venmo'd a sum that barely skimmed the number I'd lost, and agreed to a weekly repayment plan that felt like shoelaces around a limb. I accepted it because the alternative was not practical for me. I accepted it because Marcus's face, when he told me what he'd found, said we could argue ourselves into ruin. I accepted it because I had to get out. That decision cost me. There were moving vans and last-minute deposits and a new security deposit that was absurdly high because I had a short rental history in the records. There were fees, bank transfer fees, Priya's delivery fee for cardboard that was somehow the most expensive food I'd bought in months, and the emotional tax of rehearsed small talk with coworkers who had been watching. My credit didn't take a hit to the point of collapse, but I ate into the emergency money that I had been guarding like some private altar. I paid to buy my freedom and left a trail of receipts that read like a confession: account transfer, moving company, security deposit, repaid friend, thanks. The math was ugly, but functional. There was a second kind of cost that didn't show up on spreadsheets. Every time I walked past the space where my shoebox had lived under the bed, I felt the memory of absence like a bruise. The envelope, the one with the cash taped and folded and hidden under a pattern only I knew, was still gone. That was the thing that had sent me down the rabbit hole of quiet surveillance and receipts in the first place. I'd been proud of my ingrained smallness, the habits that let me save without announcing it to the world. Mia had picked that lock of privacy because it was accessible and because I had trusted the wrong smile. I let myself be gullible and I catalogued it in the ledger as a cost. Moving day was organized and low drama. Priya arrived at 8, hair scraped back, already chewing a granola bar she swore was energy. Marcus came with a sensible truck and more binders than a man moving his life should ever own. We packed boxes in categories that felt like contracts: replaceable, irreplaceable, and things I carried because they mapped better to who I was than to a future address. Mia stayed out of the way, her eyes a calm blue that had been practiced to look like nothing had happened. We signed a clean break for the apartment and I changed my locks the same afternoon. The landlord pretended to be neutral, his indifference was a small mercy. When I taped up the last box, a quiet, efficient seal of packing tape, I went under the bed to pull out the empty shoe box lid and check one more time. I expected to feel the same thinness, the way your mouth feels when you touch a dental cavity you didn't know you had. Instead, my fingers closed on something folded small and soft, wedged behind the box in a seam I must have missed when I moved towels. It was a tiny scrap of paper, browned at the edges and creased from being folded into 4. My handwriting scrawled across it in a hand I recognized as my own from years of lists and reminders, for down payment, no touch. Under that, in a different color ink, a date from 6 months earlier and a note: remember why you started. I sat on the floor with the scrap between my fingers and felt something unclench. It was ridiculous and perfect, an act of self-direction from a quieter, more hopeful version of myself. Who knew you could write a promise to yourself and tuck it into a shoebox like a talisman? I had been careful enough to do that. I had self to be constant. The scrap didn't fix what Mia had done. The missing cash still meant I would pay more, work harder, and delay the exact timeline I'd built for myself. But the scrap reminded me that my instincts at their best, my ability to plan, to hide things for future me, to keep a ledger, were still intact. The trust I'd misplaced in Mia didn't erase the trust one could still place in myself. I left the apartment with the scrap in my pocket, the last box labeled sentimental, do not drop, in the back of the truck, and a calculation on my phone that would be my next 6 months. I didn't press charges. I didn't press a final, cinematic justice. I chose a more practical kind of exit, a partial restitution, a new lease, a smaller safety net and the knowledge that I could rebuild. It felt like trading in an expensive watch for a better pair of shoes. As we pulled away, the building shrank in the rearview. I ran the numbers one last time in my head and tried to be honest about how much I'd been willing to sacrifice to leave. I also thought about Mia's face when she offered to make it right, the cultivated hurt that had been a bargaining chip. I wondered if honesty could ever be a currency again once someone had spent it on lies. Could the same hands that took be trusted to return?